Right. Gracie stea Ritona, vaveasque cultori tuo. In the name of the immortal gods and goddesses, let us begin. May they look favorably on our endeavors. My presentation today concerns the goddess Ritona, the goddess at the ford. The presentation will mainly cover ground that I previously explored in a series of blog posts in 2016. In addition, there will be a ritual element at the end of the presentation, when I will make gifts to the goddess on behalf of those who are attending. For those who don't know me, my name's Owen, pronouns he, him, or they, them, and I'm also known for religious purposes as Vidicus brigantici filius. As I run the website DeoMercurio.be and the blog DeoMercurio.wordpress.com, there are also those who call me DeoMercurio, which is appropriate since I am indeed devoted to the god Mercury. I'm a Gallo-Roman polytheist and a member of Mantalon Volgon, the tradition of the Belgi, which is relevant since the goddess Ritona is chiefly attested in Gallia Belgica and exclusively during the Gallo-Roman period. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation on land ceded to the US by the Potawatomi people and by their allies, the Ottawas and Ojibways, land historically sacred to them, as well as to the Sauk and Fox nations, and the Miami, Mascoutin, and Illini peoples. If you would like to include an acknowledgement of the peoples on whose ancestral land you now are, please do so now in the chat. I thank the spirits of this land, and the gods venerated by its indigenous peoples, and the spirits of the dead buried hereabouts, as I do this presentation and ritual in this place. And now I'd like to first give a historical overview of what we know about Ritona, which will be followed by some snippets of speculation and my own unverified personal gnosis, or UPG, before you join with me in worshiping the great goddess at the ford. You can leave questions in the chat, as I'll pause for questions in a couple of places later on. Ritona, by some measures, must rank as one of the most major of the so-called minor deities of northern and eastern Gaul. Her cult is attested from a number of places, and her worshippers include people from a diverse range of social classes and backgrounds. At least 2 temples are known to have been dedicated to her. One was in the Altbachtal, a sacred district of the city of Augusta Treverorum, or modern-day Trier in southwestern Germany. The other was away south at Montarin-Saint-Métier near Uzès in the Languedoc region of southern France. Other places where religious inscriptions mention Ritona are the Vicus Contiomagus, or modern-day Pachten, a section of Dillingen in the Saarland of southwestern Germany, and Caen on the border of the Aidouille and Senones in present-day Burgundy. Taken together, this represents 3 different Gallic nations, the Treverai, the Aidouille, and the Volcae Arecomici. An additional inscription is really very fragmentary, but if it mentions Ritona, then that places a 3rd temple, also in the country of the Aidouille, at modern-day Saint-Honoré-les-Bains in Burgundy, which, interestingly, is a site with hot springs, a theme I'll return to later on. So Ritona is mentioned on some 7 inscriptions, and about 4 of these, rather a high number, associate her with the imperial house or with the numen of Augustus. Broadly, this can be taken as an index of her importance. It means that Ritona is concerned with high affairs of state. She is mentioned in the same breath as those who were then understood to be the intermediaries between the gods and the wider community of mortals. And yet, despite such indices of her importance, Ritona remains in many ways an enigma. Much about her is not known, and of her ancient depictions, only one meager fragment remains. To know her better, we must dig deeper. And the first place to dig is in the meaning of her name. Ritona is blessed with one of those names that in Gaulish is easy to understand. The root is rit, the same that we find today in the Welsh word rhyd, meaning ford. This is followed by that divine or augmentive suffix on, familiar from so many divine names like Epona, Thirona, Damona, Maponus, Carnonos, to name but a few. Now, some people gloss this suffix as god or goddess, and others as the great. So Ritona has the plain meaning of ford goddess or the great ford. Now, there's a fun fact about the root rit. It is one of those where Celtic has lost an ancient P from prit, the same P that in Germanic turns into an F and gives us our English word ford, as well as firth and fjord, while in Romance it stays P and gives us portus, and hence English port and portal. The Proto-Celtic form would have been hrit, with a sort of ghostly h where the P once was. Now, it so happens that our religious inscriptions to Ritona use two variants of her name. One is Ritona, but the other is Pritona, which still has the P that should have been lost in late Proto-Celtic. So how did this form Pritona survive with the P intact? We might be looking at a relic form, an example of religious language being unusually archaic, which certainly happens sometimes. Or, just possibly, the name Pritona was borrowed in ancient times into a language that still had a P sound, the hypothetical Belgic language, for example. And the name Pritona was later borrowed back with the initial P through contact between Belgic and Celtic speakers. Well, that's just my theory, but it would make sense since we're talking about a multilingual contact zone in Gallia Belgica. And lest anybody tell me that I'm all confused and that Ritona and Pritona are completely different deities and how dare I mix the two up, we do have an ancient source that actually uses both names together as Dea Ritona Pritona, which I have to say I quite like the ring of. I mean, as a mantra or chant, it writes itself. Ave Dea Ritona Pritona. You get the idea. As long as we're digging into the minutiae around this name, let me point out that, according to our etymology, the I should be short, as should the O. So Ritona rather than Ritona, while the final A is long in Gaulish and short in Latin. I anglicize this in pronunciation as Ritona, just because that sounds more natural when I'm speaking in English. But since nothing's ever simple, Xavier de la Mare and some other scholars think Ritona's name does not derive from ritu, ford, but from ritus, which has a different Celtic root that sounds the same but means running. They sound the same in Celtic, but in Indo-European, ritus never had a P. So this theory, in my considered opinion, is just plain silly. I mean, what's the argument? There just happened to be fortuitous syncretism between Ritona, goddess of running, and Pritona, unrelated goddess of the pre-Celtic but clearly Indo-European ford. As it's just showing the intro page. Okay. Hmm. All right. Would that be in change windows? Okay. Okay. I want to look for screens. That's the one I'm on. So, are y'all seeing a screen that's yellow with my little analogical blah blah blah? What? Seeing the desktop? No. Okay. Great. Okay. So you're seeing the first screen now. And if I advance like so, do you see the map of inscriptions? Okay. All right. Sorry about that. That's how this should have been running all along. So just to recap briefly, here are places where there were inscriptions found in various sort of tribal territories as indicated on the map. And now we're up to speed with my etymology talk. Okay, so I do understand Ritona to be above all a goddess at the ford, a place where there can be a safe crossing of a river, a concept obviously laden with symbolic meaning, which we shall explore presently. The idea of Ritona as ford goddess might make you think that she is a goddess of a place, namely a single particular ford, or that she is a water nymph. But the evidence I've noted contradicts that interpretation. First, we find her in multiple places, and second, she has higher and, as it were, more august associations as well. I'll dig into these matters of interpretation when we verge later on into speculation or plausible surmise rather than hard evidence. But since we have only a handful of inscriptions to Ratona, I may as well briefly present them to you. So I'm hoping you can see inscriptions now. Excellent. Okay. Here's the text of the first group. So broadly speaking, there's nothing too out of the ordinary here. These are monuments of acts of religious devotion. In some cases, they're in fulfillment of a vow. In other words, if you promise something to Ratona in exchange for some blessing and she comes through, then you give your votive gift. Hence the basic formula: to the deity, name of dedicant, VLSM, or willingly and duly fulfilled their vow. That's the standard abbreviation of votum solvit libens merito, as you can see in the inscription at the bottom left here. Making vows to the deities, and if applicable, fulfilling them, is one of the key acts of faith in Gallo-Roman religion. In case something seems to be done, oh, sorry, in one case something seems to be done by order of the goddess, that's the same inscription at the bottom left there. But this part of the inscription is too fragmentary for us to say much about. That's that ex iusu part. From Gallia Belgica, we have these four inscriptions. Three of them are from Trier, and one from Pachten, all of which are in the ancient territory of the Treveri, the Celtic people of what's now Luxembourg, southwestern Germany, and bits of Belgium and France. They show the range of people who worshipped Ritona: Roman citizens, former slaves, whole communities. It's these Belgic inscriptions, and they alone, that use the name variant Pratona, which we don't find farther south. From the inscription from Contumagus, we can learn that the goddess Pratona was also syncretized with some other goddess, whose name unfortunately is too fragmentary for us to be sure about. It starts with a CA and ends with ONA, possibly a goddess local to the area. So these are the inscriptions from Gallia Belgica. From elsewhere, we have one unambiguous temple dedication in Languedoc, a plausible one in Burgundy, and a charming funerary stele from Caen in Burgundy, which associates Ritona with Minerva. I'll have a lot more to say about the Caen stele in a bit. Now, I'm a visual person, and I like to have visible simulacra of deities to focus my mind on them. The physical depictions of Ritona, however, are very scanty. There are a number of ex-votos, but really only one sculpture plainly and overtly sets out to depict her, or more accurately, to depict Pritona, for the inscription uses that variant of her name. And here it is. This is the depiction of Pritona from Contiomagus, or Pachten. Now, as you can see, this sculpture is only a fragment. It does depict Pritona's feet, which may be a providential survival, and enough of her legs to show that she was dressed and seated in a way reminiscent of the mother goddesses of the region. To Pritona's left might be a cornucopia at her feet, of which only the pointy end survives. So at least Arya Stark would be happy with that. However, apparently some people see this as a dog, or a part of a dog, which would also fit with the Trevor and Mother Goddess theme, but honestly, I don't see it. Maybe I'm not squinting right. So this fragment gives us something, but it doesn't tell us, for example, what Ritona would have had in her hands, or what her face looked like, or whether she had anything on her head, like a veil, a crown, antlers, or a helmet, or whether there were any birds or trees or whatever else overhead. She seems to have something on her lap, but I couldn't say what. We can see that, like the Matrone, she is majestically enthroned, yet ready to extend the hand of compassion to those less fortunate. That's something. To give a little context for this find, Contiomagus was a vicus, or settlement, on the river Saravus, one of those places where there was a bridge over that fairly important river. The town also had a temple to Mercury near the Ritona find. So that's the only depiction explicitly meant to show the goddess herself. On the other hand, the inscription at Caen is accompanied by this jolly-looking fellow over on the left of the screen, who's holding out an offering dish, maybe with some little cakes on it, possibly little fruits, and is pouring out a libation to Minerva and Ritona. So this depiction is presumably not of the goddess, but of the worshipper, Aprilis Tami Filius. From it, we know that these kinds of things are acceptable offerings to the goddesses. Caen, by the way, is near the tribal border between the Senones and the Aedui, not unlike Contiomagus, which similarly is in a border area between Treveran and Mediomatrican territory. Some deities, as we know from elsewhere, were venerated at border shrines, specifically so that their places of worship would be accessible to people from both communities, emphasizing their role as liminal deities of places of passage. Vosegus and Intarabus were certainly deities like this, and it seems that Ritona is another. Before we leave the question of her iconography, I'll mention some additional votive remains, in this case found near the Ritona temple in the Altbachtal. That's the sacred precinct in Trier that I mentioned earlier. You can see a reconstruction of the temple over on the right. Pilgrims apparently deposited near Ritona's temple a terracotta of Diana, one of Fortuna, two of Minerva, three statuettes of Matrone, and two unidentified male busts. Oh, and one of Venus as well. And there is a depiction of a cornucopia, and, unusually, a votive tablet where somebody carved the outline of a pair of human feet, which I've traced over on the lower left of your screen. So let's stick a pin in that. Ritona plays well with others, so much so that her worshippers thought she'd like to receive votive gifts depicting other deities, notably the Matrone and Minerva. And something about her is relevant to feet. Well, perhaps that shouldn't surprise us. As a goddess of fords, where people can cross on foot rivers that would otherwise require a boat. I'd also like to draw some attention to the context of Ritona's temple in the Altbachtal. The Altbachtal is one of the key sacred areas of Trier, which at the time was the tribal capital of the Treveri and would eventually become one of the main power centers of the Roman Empire in the west. The Fanum of Ritona, a two-story rectangular building with a lovely little portico all around it, is in a little cluster of temples set somewhat apart from the main group. Close by, within this cluster, was a pillar dedicated to the god Vorio, as well as shrines to Epona, to the bull god, to mother goddesses, Mercury, Aveta, and Fortuna, as well as an impressive temple that I'm guessing might possibly have been dedicated to Mars and Nemetona. Now, none of this is conclusive of anything. Perhaps all of these temples are just a disorganized jumble, but then again, perhaps they're not. There might, for example, be a closer relationship between Ritona and some or all of these deities than with the other deities worshipped in the Altbachtal, like Mithras or Icovelauna. Geographically, there's an interesting coincidence between the Altbachtal and Contiomagus. Both are sites on large rivers, the Moselle and the Saar, respectively, where there is a confluence with a smaller stream, the Altbach or the Prinz, near a place where the bigger river can be forded or bridged. And the site at Caen is also right on a river, the Icauna or Yonne, though there isn't really a smaller connecting stream immediately there. Before we leave the firm grounds of what is historically known about Ritona and take off into the mists of speculation, I'd like to ask if there are any questions at this point. Did anybody leave questions in the chat? No questions? Okay. So about 5 years ago, I started really wishing I could deepen my devotional relationship with Ritona. And I felt called upon to create a new sacred image of her that would not contradict, but complement, or even complete our historically attested image from Contiomagus. Through divination, I obtained some specific guidance that gave me a lot to go on, and then I sifted through various free images that I could mash up and repurpose into something novel. I wanted to begin with a clothed, seated figure, on analogy with the seated goddess of Contiomagus. I found an appropriate analog in the allegory of strength, or Stärke, from a monument at Vienna's Hofburg Palace by Pompeo Marchesi. As a nod to Ritona's associations with Minerva, I gave her a spear, as well as a shield that features the head of a gorgon, as does the shield of Mars found in a sculpture from the Altbachtal itself. And I also included a cornucopia, as in the Contiomagus image. So here you can see the resulting depiction, assuming the video feed is still working, my 2016 revisualization of an ancient deity. I tried to cram a lot of symbolism into this image, so if you don't mind, I'll comment on a few aspects of it in more detail. The starting point, as I said, was the figure of Stärke, or strength, which seems quite appropriate for Ritona, whose association with fording naturally suggests strength in the face of obstacles. I especially liked this image because Marchesi's Stärke wears a corona civica, or crown of oak leaves. The corona civica has certain Augustan connotations that work nicely given the persistent connection between Ritona and the noumena of the Augusti. Now, the background is actually a photo I took in 2007 of the river Moselle in Trier at the Roman bridge, the same ancient bridge that would have existed in the days when Ritona's temple still stood, and which had been built on the site of, drumroll, an ancient ford. Ritona, in this image, would therefore be sitting on the right bank of the Moselle, which is the same bank as, as the Altbachtal sanctuary, although the latter is actually a bit farther back from the river. In addition to the cornucopia at Ritona's feet, with its symbolism of abundance and its link to the Matroni and Fortuna, I've also placed a bird, larger than life-sized, a bittern, walking through the reeds near a wetland. Now, the bittern is not historically attested as an emblem of Ritona, but as a bird known for wading through the shallows, and with some intriguing associations in legend and folklore, I think its inclusion is defensible. Cranes, egrets, and the like might also have been appropriate. Now, there's one final iconographic element here that I want to spend a little time on. If you haven't noticed the clouds in the sky to Ritona's right, let me draw your attention to them and point out that they are shaped like a pair of footprints. This references the carved outline of feet deposited as a votive offering to Ritona in the Altbachtal. As I said, this is a somewhat unusual gift, and there are many possible interpretations of it. I'll just mention a few, all highly suggestive of what Ritona might have meant to her ancient worshippers. The votive feet might be a token of thanks to Ritona for healing a foot injury, or restoring function to feet that were lame or afflicted with gout or the like. Or, perhaps more likely, they may be in thanks for granting safe passage over a ford, an emblem of a journey successfully completed. And the ford in such a context might itself be symbolic, indicating a difficult passage fraught with danger, taking a person outside of their comfort zone, perhaps even crossing over in some kind of spiritual transformation, crossing between realms, boundaries, or ways of doing things. Then again, it might acknowledge Ritona's help in withstanding some literal or figurative current or obstacle. No doubt there are other possible interpretations besides, nor must such interpretations be mutually exclusive. And this brings me to the broader theme of how to interpret Ritona's gifts to humankind. Here I'm going to veer more firmly into the territory of unverified personal gnosis, so take it or leave it at your discretion. As a goddess at the ford, Ritona is someone we can call upon to help us find our way in unfamiliar territory, when we must advance by touch, by footfall, rather than sticking to what is clear and unthreatening. Conceived of in this way, Ritona might rightly be called upon for many reasons other than when literally getting your feet wet. She is a goddess of breaking beyond previous constraints, a goddess of transition, a goddess of new opportunities. It is perhaps fitting then that, through divination, I've been told to think of Ritona not strictly as a matrona, a mother goddess, but as a pregnant mother-to-be. In crossing over, in taking the first step, I see Ritona as a goddess who can help souls cross the threshold from the other world back into our own and emerge embodied as babies, who, of course, are already capable swimmers and eager to take their first steps as soon as they're strong enough. In my UPG, Ritona, like many deities in Gaul associated with water, particularly thermal springs, as we find at Saint-Honoré-les-Bains, illustrated at the bottom left, can be seen as a healer. Again, think of the invalid taking those difficult steps from convalescence to wellness, a goddess, if you like, of the process of rehab or physical therapy or mental therapy. And like many healing deities in Gaul, Ritona, if my UPG is to be credited, can be seen as a fighter, one who battles against obstacles. In that context, an overlap between her role and that of Minerva can be seen. Minerva is a goddess of war, and Minerva Medica is a goddess of healing. Moreover, we see Minerva statuettes given to Ritona as offerings, and I'd like to point out again that at Caen, an inscription is apparently dedicated to Minerva and Ritona, much as we see elsewhere inscriptions to Mercury and Rosmerta, to Granus and Thirona, to Jupiter and Epona. Now, in the case of these opposite sex dedications, we do not hesitate to posit a divine marriage between the deities in question. In my own understanding, Minerva is likewise the companion of Ritona, the wife, if you prefer, because Minerva is, unless I'm mistaken, described as a virgin goddess in the specific sense that she wants nothing to do with men. About any dalliances with Gaulish goddesses, our ancient sources are strictly silent. Incidentally, lately I've been offering a joint cultus to Minerva and Ritona on the Lesser Quinquatria, which seems to work out nicely. That's the 13th of June, one of the days traditionally associated with traditionally sacred to Minerva in the Roman calendar. So mark your calendars for that if you're interested. Through divination and meditation, I've also been told that I may conceive of Ritona as somehow analogous to, or perhaps a protege of, the goddess Venus, who, as we have seen, is one of the deities depicted on votive statuettes by Ritona's temple in the Altbachtal, along with Diana, Fortuna, and others. Venus and Gaul, there are a number of possible connections between these two. Certainly, Venus has all sorts of watery connections, and one of the most common ways of depicting her is as Venus drying her hair, Venus emerging from the waves. She is a helper of those in need, certainly of those seeking love, and dare I say it, love perhaps is the greatest transformation of all. I've elaborated on all of these themes and several more beside in a short story that I published on my blog under the name of Tales of Ritona. I describe it there as fan fiction, and the tone is largely playful. In a very loose sense, it is mythology, and though obviously I like the tales I've written, I only put them together to synthesize the themes that I've just mentioned into something that makes sense to me. So you can take them or leave them as you will. But for those who might be interested, I'll just mention that the Tales of Ritona elaborate on the goddess's romance with Minerva and offer one version of how she might be related to Epona, Diana, Venus, Nemetona and Mars, Sylvanus, and Vorio, Alana, and Bodina, and of course Mercury, because obviously I had to sneak in a nice appearance for Mercury into my story. So much for the Tales of Ritona. Talking of tales, however, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the theme of the Ford from comparative mythology. Though, to be honest, I'm not aware of close parallels in the usual places, Celtic, classical, or Germanic texts. Now, in Irish mythology, we have, among many mentions of fords in the Gentianachus, the arresting image of the Morrigan washing by the ford of Unshin as the Dagda comes up to her, as well as that of Cuchulainn and his epic battle with Fergiad at the ford of Ardee. Classical mythology provides us with, for example, the image of Io crossing the Bosphorus in the form of a cow, or Priam fording the Scamander to bring the body of Hector back to Troy. All of these stories involve fords, yet none line up very closely with the various bits of evidence we have of Ritona from Gaul, and each tells quite a different story. Lots of things happen at fords because they are doubly liminal. A riverbank is already liminal. A river crossing is liminal. But to cross a river on solid ground over a submerged path that looks like it shouldn't exist is still more so. It's a kind of semi-aquatic crossroads, to take up an idea that Kasana Sunikya is developing. Now, Ritona doesn't own all of this Ford mythology, but she has a certain stake in the specific liminality that provides its setting. So now that I've spoken some about my interpretations of Ritona, I'd like to check if there are any questions before we begin the ritual portion of the presentation. Okay. Okay, all right, all right. Let's see then. Trying to figure out how I ought to do this. So Kunobalanos was speculating that I would be able to do both a video feed and screen share at the same time, potentially. So does that seem to be working, or can you see just me, or what? Okay, cool. All right, so I'll have the desktop handy, and without further ado, then I'll begin the ritual portion. So I ritually purified myself and this space with water before the presentation began. So you as attendees may wish to do something along the same lines now from wherever you are, according to your tradition, while I do some more preliminaries for the ritual. I should mention that I'm conducting this ritual on behalf of attendees. So if, for whatever reason, you do not want to be included and partake of Ritona's blessings, now would be the time for you to step away from the video or stop the feed. I'll now cover my head as I am about to offer gift. This is something I do when sacrificing, not with every deity, of course, as your mileage will vary. And now I'll light a candle. And as a final preliminary, I'll share a brief introit. Salve Dea Ritona, Britona, Ave Dea Ritona, Salve Dea Ritona, Britona, Ave Dea Ritona. Oh, yeah, slow pace. I'll now start the offering portion using an offertory formula in Latin. After each offering, I'll say "Macte virtute esto," which is sort of untranslatable, but it's a kind of ritual exclamation point on one's offerings. When I say "Macte virtute esto," please join me wherever you are by repeating the word "Macte." So first, repeat after me, "Macte." Lovely. And your cue is "Macte virtute esto," whereupon you say "Macte." Brilliant. So the first offering I shall make is a reading of a hymn that I composed for Ritona a while back. I'll put this on the screen for you so that you can read along from wherever you are if you wish. I wonder if I can make this full screen. same time. There we go. The material of this hymn will obviously be familiar to all of us after the foregoing presentation. Hail to you, Ritona Pritona, favored companion of grey-eyed Minerva, the wise and generous. Honored in the Altbachtal, enthroned in majesty, you behold the graceful meanderings of the holy Moselle. In past ages, worshippers piously adorned your sanctuary with the sacred images of Minerva and Diana, of the Matrone, Venus and Fortuna. Your divinity was celebrated too in distant places where the paths of strangers crossed. To you I turn when my step seems unsure, my path treacherous and hard to discern. To you I turn when in need of aid to withstand the currents of misfortune. To you I turn when I must venture beyond what is familiar, trusted, and known. You I will trust to guide my step, nor shall I fear currents or eddies, or the cold depths of strange waters, so long as you, Ritona, lead me through. For the Numina of the Augusti, hail, goddess at the ford, pathfinder, intercessor, friend of good fortune. Mac de virtutes. I'll now offer Ritona a gift of incense, asking for her favor to us and all her worshippers. Ritona, te hoc tuus praestendo, bonas preces, precor tisies valens propetia, nobis, omnibusque cultoribus tuis. Mac de virtutes. I'll continue with a gift of wine, which I'll pour into an offering bowl. Dea Ritona Pritona, te hoc vinum libando, bonas preces, precor potisies volens propetia nobis omnibusque cultoribus tuis. Mac de virtute esto. Ready for one more? So I have a plate ready with little sweets to offer to Ritona, comparable to the ones we saw on that stele from Caen, in case you can see this. These are called liba, singular libum, which are sort of little cheesecakes glazed with honey. And what I'll do is sprinkle them with a salted flour mixture, which is called mola salsa. And by sprinkling it, I'll mark these as a sacrificial offering. So this is called immolation. Actually, nothing to do with burning originally. Dea Ritona Pritona, te haec liba immolando, bonas preces, precor, potitias valens propitia nobis omnibusques cultoribus tuis. Mac de virtute est. And now, having given, we may pause to bathe in the blessings of Ritona Pritona. If you're watching this on the YouTube feed, this would be a great opportunity to pause, do some meditation, visualization, Um, for us who are live, and I know there's another presentation coming up shortly, let's just pause briefly and, as we do, enjoy a few iterations of that chant from earlier. Ave Dea Ritona Britona, 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 Ave Dea Ritona Britona. And for my last trick, I'll draw lots to see if these gifts are acceptable. So I interpret this omen to have to do with the fulfillment of desires, of deeply rooted yearnings, fulfilled in the form of like a banquet or feast, something along this order. Although there is a sort of note of caution in terms of the surrounding parameters, I guess, of the feasting situation, where there is some kind of threat from without. So, apart from that note of caution, which I suppose could be the comments of haters on YouTube eventually, who knows, something like that. This is a favorable omen, for sure, and a sign that our gifts have been received. And with that, I thank you, Dea Ritona, for being present at this ritual and for receiving these gifts on behalf of myself and your other worshippers. I thank the genius of this place, the spirits of the land, the nymphs, and the spirits of the honored dead for permitting this ritual to take place. The rite is ended. Pax deorum esto. May there be the peace of the gods. One final thing that I want to leave you with is a homework assignment. So in this final slide, I list a number of musical suggestions. Now that you've accompanied me through this presentation and ritual, feel free to listen to any of this music at your leisure. And your homework is to think about how each song or piece of music relates to Ritona and the themes of crossing into the unknown, of embracing transformation, of withstanding vicissitudes. A final suggestion I'd like to leave you with is of a service project that may be appropriate as a devotional act to Ritona, namely helping those who are faced with a difficult crossing. I'm especially thinking of those who have faced the treacherous waters of the Rio Grande and who must now confront the difficulties of border controls, legal limbo, and culture shock. Donating money, time, tweets, or whatever else to a group such as Raíces or similar seems to me an appropriate tribute to this goddess who favors those undertaking a difficult crossing. Other groups besides Raíces, such as the International Rescue Committee or UNHCR, might be appropriate as well. Thank you very much for attending. Hail to the goddess at the ford.